Libo.
Hello, my name is Sara and Revekka, and I'm writing today because it has come to my attention that a student of yours, Mark Gondelman, is being accused of harassment by multiple people.
This is a letter that Sara Revekka sent to administrators at New York University in February of 2021. At the time, Sara had lived in the US for 8 years, and Mark was getting his PhD at NYU.
I wanted to share my part of the story in those accusations. Mark and I started dating, quote-unquote, when I was 12 and he was 23. We were together for over a year until I broke it off. Many things were deeply wrong with that relationship, starting from the fact that he convinced me to have sex, which, even though it was as consensual as sex between a 12-year-old and a 23-year-old can be, I was not ready for, and ending with the fact that he would manipulate and guilt-trip me into staying with him every time I would try to leave. The emotional manipulation and control did not stop there. Throughout our relationship, he fed into my teenage insecurities, got jealous when I would spend too much time with friends, and caused a rift in my relationship with my family. I lost a few years of my childhood to him, and never saw him suffer any repercussions for that.
Sara was writing to NYU's Title IX office. Title IX refers to legislation passed in the United States in the 1970s to prevent sex-based discrimination in schools. These days, it counts sexual abuse and harassment as forms of discrimination. It requires federally funded universities to hire a Title IX coordinator who will investigate and respond to complaints against students and staff. Sara was hopeful that her complaint would be investigated.
The physical acts of it happened in Israel and Russia. In both of those countries, the age of consent is 16. So technically, while not under the American jurisdiction, he still very much committed a crime that he has not been brought to justice for. Despite the fact that I consider what happened to me traumatic, the main reason I'm writing today is that I found out that after our so-called relationship ended, Mark dated another underage person and assaulted and physically, and knowing him emotionally, abused several other women who had the misfortune of coming into close contact with him. I do not want what happened to me to happen to anyone else. I do not want this man to have a chance at a life that he thinks he deserves. I'm writing in hopes that the people in charge of his career have strong enough evidence of his character to prevent him from gaining more power in his chosen field, knowing the likelihood of him abusing that power eventually. I'm happy to provide more evidence needed to bring Mark to justice. Respectfully, Sara.
From Libo, you're listening to The Adults in the Room. My name is Nastya Krasilnikova. This is Episode 7, Institutional Betrayal. Sara says that after she wrote to NYU's Title IX office, she got a response pretty quickly.
They said, well, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We would like to further discuss this with you. And we met over Zoom, talked for an hour. It was two HR ladies. They were both very sympathetic. They asked me a bunch of very, polite and considering questions. And they expressed their condolences for my terrible experience. And they asked me about my career plans. Basically, we had this beautiful heart to heart. I think they were we're collecting evidence. We don't really know what to do. I was like, yep, no problem. Let me know if I can provide any further information. At the end of that conversation, they were like, well, one thing we can definitely do is to reach out to him and to make, sure that you get closure by talking to him or something. I was like, oh, yeah, maybe not, but, thanks for the offer, I guess. And then I hung up and I was like, wait a second, that really, that didn't feel right at all. And so I emailed them being like, hey, I just want to reiterate, under no circumstances do I want Mark to contact me. I'm not sure if he heard me. He's a pedophile. I was a child. I feel like there's some sort of miscommunication. And they were like, okay, yeah, no problem. If you don't want us to contact him, we won't contact him. It was great. Fantastic. Okay, great. So close that option. Let's see what else you do. And they were like, well, sit tight. We'll investigate and get back to you with further steps. Again, empty words, just water, nothing.
I've read this chain of emails. It took Title IX employees 4 months to get back to Sara. That email said, "The matter we discussed has been appropriately addressed and documented by the university and is being closed." Revekka also wrote to Title IX at NYU and told them her story.
And then all we received from them was that we can't really do anything about it because it's not under our jurisdiction because it didn't happen on campus. They wrote me a follow-up email later on saying, "We decided that the case is closed." And I was like, "What do you mean it's closed? Does it mean that you addressed it somehow?" And they were like, "Nah, it's just closed. That's just our protocol." And I was like, "Cool. Doesn't sound particularly helpful, but I get it. It's not under your jurisdiction."
Title IX employees did everything by the book. NYU's Title IX reporting guidelines state that the university must dismiss allegations of incidents that didn't occur within an NYU educational program or activity, or that didn't happen in the United States. Revekka and Sara were not participating in educational activities at NYU, and the alleged abuse by Mark Gondelman didn't happen on American soil. Nevertheless, that decision felt unjust.
And then I was so fucking pissed. I was angry. I couldn't believe that's how little personal evidence can matter without a legal case. Because to me, there's also a common sense aspect of the situation from the NYU HR standpoint, right? Academia is a pretty tight and kind of closed off community. Therefore, your reputation just has a lot of weight. So when you're discarding, truly throwing in the trash the evidence of actual fucking rape of one of your staff, you are therefore taking on a massive liability. That's the main aspect of it. You don't know what's going to happen and you're not protecting yourself and you're not protecting others. You're putting future students who are smart and driven and want to study philosophy and just want to do something they're passionate about, you're saying their lives don't matter.
Mark Gondelman got his PhD in Jewish Studies in 2022. After he graduated, Mark got a job as a research assistant at Goethe University in Frankfurt. He has since taught a seminar on Jewish thought. As you might remember from episode 1, I traveled last summer to Frankfurt to look for Mark.
So now I'm looking for the Equal Opportunities Office here in Goethe University.
Before confronting Mark at that conference, I visited Goethe University's Title IX office equivalent, the Equal Opportunities Office.
And the guard in the information center, he doesn't know. He's never heard of the Equal Opportunities Office here in the university, but he directed me somewhere, so I'm trying to find it.
The sticker on the door of the office said, "Every day is an equality day." I introduced myself and explained that I was an independent journalist with disturbing information about one of the university's employees. A friendly woman heard me out and gave me the email of her colleague who handles these cases. I emailed that person the same day. Then I was off to the conference where I knew Mark would be presenting.
I'm not very comfortable with trying to find a man who is not willing to talk to me, and I'm not very comfortable with invading this academic conference. And but then I think, well, the only thing I want to do is ask him questions. The only thing I want to do is just try and hold him accountable. So, and I think about that he probably was not uncomfortable with doing what he was doing with underage girls. So why should I be uncomfortable with what I am doing?
As you might remember, I overcame my discomfort and walked up to Mark when he came outside for a break. When he turned and ran back into the building, the guards blocked me from entering. And that's the last contact I've had with Mark Gondelman. As a journalist who covers violence against women and children, I often feel desperate. I see my sources trying to get justice, but the systems they rely on in different parts of the world fail them again and again. I've tried with my producer, whose name is also Nastya, to get a comment from the Title IX employees at New York University. We've sent emails, we've called, and we've even asked our colleague who was visiting New York to try getting answers face-to-face. I desperately wanted to know how NYU's Title IX coordinators make their decisions and why it took them 4 months to respond to this case. But we never got a reply. It turns out, complaints made to Title IX offices are confidential for all parties involved. The U.S. Department of Education requires that universities protect the identities of both complainants, alleged victims, and respondents, alleged perpetrators. But we also asked to talk to someone from the office about the decision-making process in general. We got no answer. I never heard back from Goethe University's Equal Opportunities Office either. I followed up a couple months later, and again, got no reply. Maybe this sounds naive, but I was shocked by this whole experience. I've never been to the US, but I've always watched it closely. This is the country where the Me Too movement was born. Me Too affected Russia as well. Many women have come forward with their stories of gender-based violence. But in the US, free speech really means something. I've never experienced that kind of freedom as a journalist in Russia. So the decision by NYU's Title IX office to close Revekka's and Sara's cases was disheartening to me. Maybe my judgment was clouded by the illusion that the West really cares about women's rights, and that words like "every day is an equality day" mean something. I don't have that illusion anymore. On one hand, I get it. If Title IX regulations say NYU doesn't have jurisdiction, then they don't have jurisdiction. It's a complicated case, with abuse in one country and both perpetrator and victims now in another. But I think there is something else going on here. For an alleged sex offender to fall through the cracks like this, and for institutions to feel so little need to answer for it, something has to go wrong. I'm thinking back to the way I felt on that visit to Goethe University. Uncomfortable. I'd been hearing stories of horrible sexual abuse, and still I felt uneasy about disturbing some university conference to ask questions about it. And I was only visiting the campus for the day. What if you worked there? What if Mark was your colleague? And what if you'd never met Sara or Revekka? What would you do if you heard a story about Mark's behavior? Maybe nothing. And that's how even an institution of well-meaning people can perpetuate harm.
Institutional betrayal, not always, but usually involves the combination of individual decisions as well as institutional policies and cultures.
This is Jennifer Fried. She has a PhD in the psychology of sexual abuse, and she runs the Center for Institutional Courage. She coined the term institutional betrayal. She explains how it works.
It could be a whole group of people whose individual decisions are coming together and interacting and connecting in complicated ways with the institutional culture and the policies and so on. So it's not usually a very simple matter to say, oh, there's just one bad person who's doing this. It's usually this mixture of things. There's a phrase that's used sometimes to describe when you've got a lot of things coming together to make something much worse, which is the perfect storm. So with institutional betrayal, you might have somebody who has ill intent, who actually is motivated to cover up a crime. And you might have somebody else who doesn't have ill intent, but they have their own motivation to not rock the boat, not upset things. And you put those two together, and that can create a much worse situation than if you just had one alone. Now, why do people not want to upset the way things are? That is so pervasive. That is so common. And that's because, in large part, when you upset the way things are, it tends to be costly. So if I'm in an organization that's doing something it shouldn't do, even if I'm not a direct victim, but I see it's going on, and I ring the alarm, I'm a whistleblower, I say, this isn't right, I'm at great risk of suffering some kind of retaliation, some kind of negative consequence. Perhaps I will be fired from my job, or I will be shunned and ostracized for doing that. Because when I raise those issues, I am threatening the existing power structure. And the systems in power, whether they're individuals or whole systems, are in power in part because they know how to stay in power. And how do you stay in power? You suppress when people try to take away your power. So if you question the behavior, you're essentially provoking the power structure, and it tends to bite back.
Jennifer also said something that made me think about School 57 as an institution and as a community.
You know, we are wired up to want to belong. So one person can hurt us, and one person can betray us because, you know, if you have somebody like a parent or a spouse or a best friend who you trust to be on your side and have your interests at heart, and they do something that harms you, that's a betrayal, and that's very costly. But when you magnify that by a whole group, like maybe everybody in your family or everybody in your workplace or everybody in your school, they're all agreeing that to sort of mistreat you, that's very threatening to your existence, right? So what adds to it, besides that, is that we have a tendency as humans to feel a kind of love and connection for organizations we're in. So not always, not everybody, but it is fairly common that somebody will feel like what psychologists call an attachment. And we have something well researched called the attachment system that will motivate us to connect to people especially people who provide us with some kind of resource. And that system is part of our survival.
To tell you the truth, when I heard about this concept of institutional betrayal, I felt relieved. I now had a name for a phenomenon I'd been trying to describe for years. For many Russians, institutional betrayal is very familiar. Because a state is an institution as well, and it fails its citizens by putting them in jail for expressing their opinions, by killing its government's political opponents in front of the whole world, and by refusing to let its people call a war a war. Sara, Revekka, Yegor, and many others from the School 57 community grew up surrounded by dissidents or people from dissident families. Their youth was spent while Russia was slowly falling back into dictatorship. They knew their country had betrayed them, so they moved elsewhere. They were still hopeful that outside Russia they could hold their abusers accountable. And they tried, even though it was painful. They told their stories and fought for justice. That took courage. And they counted on the institution they engaged to show that same courage.
And so we don't have, a lot of mechanisms to protect us from institutions right now. That's why I have been promoting this idea of institutional courage, which is things to sort of demand of our institutions that do require courage, that will make the institutions much safer for those of us who interact with them. I think we can change institutions.
Revekka and Sara tried to stop Mark Gondelman's academic career through Title IX. Yegor spent months of his life trying to hold Boris Meyerson accountable in Israel. And they did it not for themselves, but for those who still might suffer from the actions of their alleged abusers.
What would change if Boris Meyerson was prosecuted?
Well, first of all, it would help to prevent, further damage. He's still very much capable of abusing other children. And the second thing would be just the general contribution to the pot of justice in the world. And the third, it's something very complex for me, especially now in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But after this scandal, I promised myself to have not to do anything with, let's broadly call it Russian creative industries or whatever, not to work in Russian language, not to take any part in any projects related to Russia. And I'm not talking the state, right? I'm talking the opposition as well. But if you still speak of what this particular story could do to Russian society or to whatever will come in place of the Russian Federation, is the example that you can go against, quote unquote, your own kind for the purpose of justice, right? This is what Rivka and I did. And I think that could be very useful for people who will try to deal with the aftermath of what will happen to Russia after the war.
Changing our institutions requires average people to challenge them, like Alexei Navalny, who stood up to my homeland's government and was killed for it. And like Yegor, Sara, and Revekka, who refused to stay silent about the trauma they endured as children and were traumatized all over again by the people closest to them, but never gave up. I was inspired by their courage. In the next episode, I'm going to Yokneam, a town in Israel where Boris Meyerson lives. The Adults in the Room is produced by Libo Studio. All episodes are out now, so you can play the next one right away. This podcast has a website where you can find additional visual materials collected throughout our investigation and feedback contacts. The link is in the description box. The show is hosted, reported, and written by me, Nastya Krasilnikova. A huge thank you to my colleagues, researcher and fact-checker Vika Labanova, producers and editors Nastya Medvedeva, Sam Colbert, and Dasha Cherkudinova, composer and sound designer Ildar Fattahov, and the head of Libo, Lika Kremer. Legal support provided by Michael Svard and Alon Sapir from Michael Svard Law Office, and Sergei Markov, managing partner of the law firm Markov and Madaminov. Thank you for listening.